Hello and welcome to Monocle on Culture. I'm Robert Bound. On today's show, Severance. Apple TV's dystopian workplace drama has been one of the most talked about TV events of recent years. Now that season 2 has come to a dramatic end, we'll sit down with its creator, writer and executive producer Dan Erickson. Then we're switching to the big screen to discuss some of the best contemporary and classic Polish cinema in celebration of the Kinoteka Polish Film Festival. Do stay tuned, that's all coming up here on Monocle on Culture. The TV series Severance first appeared on Apple TV Plus in early 2022. Fans were quickly taken in by its intriguing premise, part workplace comedy, part horrifying dystopian thriller. The show centres around the mysterious and important, quote, work of Lumen Industries, a biotech company which has pioneered a procedure in which one can separate their work and non-work selves, so-called innies and outies. The work that the show's questing hero come wage slave Mark S. and his colleagues perform is comedically banal, while the office is a retro-modernist marvel that reflects some sort of poisoned well of the American dream. Severance returned to our screens this year, and the second season reached its awesome climax just a few days ago. And yes, season 3 is in the works. I sat down with the man who dreamed up this nightmarish world, Dan Erickson. And here is my conversation with Dan, well, with his outie. Dan, thank you so much for coming in to see us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, the clock is ticking for us. So we've got a million questions we really want to ask you about Severance, about the brave new world of Severance. But I wanted to know, since watching episode 1 yonks ago, really, you as the creator of this series, was it the story or the workspace itself, or the kind of broader allegory that originally was your kind of back of an envelope sketch, if I may put it like that?
I guess it would be the allegory or the concept. I mean, it was something that occurred to me as I was working an office job and just walking in one day and caught myself thinking, God, I wish I could just skip ahead 8 hours and not have to have the experience of what I'm about to go through, which is usually a sign that you're probably doing something wrong with your life. And so, but I realized that I think a lot of people would do that, and I wanted to sort of interrogate what that meant.
Yeah, I mean, there is none more sort of creative and output to do with those wasted hours, quote unquote, than to make this utterly incredible and awesome TV series. So, I mean, congratulations. You will be the first of billions to wish you that.
Thank you.
And I wondered also, you worked at a door firm, I know this, which pops up for Dylan's character in series 2, I think. Tell us about that. Where did you get the language at Lumen Industries, as especially sort of broadcast by Mr. Milchick? But a lot of the characters talk in a kind of dated but happy kind of corporate ease.
Right.
There is kind of perhaps a bit of the America of the 1950s. There's bits of Shakespearean kind of grandeur in there as well. It's wonderful stuff. Anyway, what about this punctilious language? Where did that come from?
Well, some of it came from actual places that I worked, and not necessarily the more flowery sort of almost Shakespearean stuff. A lot of that is just kind of how I tend to write, but it was infused with this weird corporate speak that I think still exists very much to this day. And, I worked a series of temp jobs. Turns out I'm a very fireable person because over the course of, a year or so, I was working maybe 3 or 4 different office jobs that I ultimately couldn't hold on to. And each one, especially one that was a global company where we were getting these sort of these orders from on high from this vague corporate group who we never met. We didn't really know what country they were in, and yet they were the ones sort of telling us how to go about our day, having never set foot in our actual office. And there was just something strange about that, and a lot of talk of sort of corporate manifestos and guides on how to be, and these are the core principles of the and they would spend all this money to go on these big vacations where they would come up with like, these are the 8 new corporate principles, and they're way better than the 7 corporate principles we had before.
They were so lame, those 7 old ones.
Yeah, I mean, it's stuff like work hard and,
This is not where you got your linguistic flights of fancy.
Yeah, no, yeah, I sort of zhuzhed them up a little bit.
And in your answer there, I'm getting a sense of one of the abiding sort of overarching themes of Severance, which is this sort of voice of God, a voice of Kia thing that is ever present in the way that innies interact with each other, the way that the town that the outies live in kind of works and operates. What about that? That's a wonderful thing, and we can talk about whether that has a sort of liturgical and ecclesiastical bent, or whether it's just satire. But did that come from any place you've worked or church you've knelt in?
I mean, we talk a lot about cults when we're in the writer's room and when we're sort of crafting the story of the show. But we sort of use this idea that a cult is, the bigger it is, the harder it is to recognize as a cult. And that there are certain traits you see in common between these giant corporations, many of whom have sort of a cult of personality around the founder or the current CEO. And this sense that, we're all part of a family, and that the work you do is somehow more noble, and that you should be able to give more fully of yourself because of this kind of family atmosphere that they claim exists. Of course, the benefits of that aren't necessarily reciprocated. In that way,
Good way of making you stay a bit longer.
Yeah. But it just, I noticed that there were some sort of traits in common, overlapping traits that you would find between a big group like that and then what we think of as a cult. And I knew people who worked for big companies and would sort of speak of the founders of those companies as though they were not godlike, but sometimes it got a little uncomfortably close to just being some kind of a messianic figure.
Yeah, I mean, there's some sort of druidic dancing we should point out. That's the only spoiler alert, is it? Which kind of comes into it. You must have had fun mixing the kind of corporate religiosity with kind of the stone circle, kind of jumping naked through fire of things. Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying you practiced that yourself in the writer's room, but
no. Well, I'm not saying I didn't. But yeah, no. There was a lot of I'm also a big fan of like the original Wicker Man and stuff like that. Some of those old like 70s cult movies that just got so creepy. And, in the case of the Waffle Party, which I believe is what you're referencing, we talked about how Lumen incentivizes and sort of perverts all of these basic human experiences, get like you're given food or you're given the ability to dance as prizes.
Yeah.
And then is sort of what would the ultimate example of that be? And it would be this very strange expression of sexuality as told through the lore of the company. So, those were moments that were fun to come to and fun to create.
Yeah, I kind of got a Wicker Man sense from it. It's one of my favourite films. I suppose one person's Gemma Scout is another person's Rowan Morrison.
Yeah, I think so.
Now, a lot of people have correctly picked up on the wonderful look and feel of the show. I mean, the aesthetics of the show. I mean, that's such a kind of strong theme of it. We are not an undesign conscious publication and radio station here at Monocle, I guess, as well. People have name-checked the Vitzo and the brown kind of set decorations, which are wonderful. But that dichotomy, I suppose, of the sexy but sterile work environment, and it's all set in such a cold state, I presume, as well. How important was that dichotomy between the inside and the outside, innie and outie, public persona and private work individual? It's so precise. You walk that tightrope as a creator and a writer so perfectly.
Oh, thank you.
I'm sure that must have been difficult to actually carry that off, though.
It was, and it's really rewarding because you see online people will post like, photos from their workplace and say like, our employee break room is very Severance coded and it'll be this, sterile white space. But to me, that just speaks to the brilliance of the designers and how they did take these real existing aesthetics and sort of gave it just a nightmarish enough twist where it feels familiar and yet totally alien. But then the question also is, how do you make that beautiful? Because we wanted to create a sense that these characters are in hell, and yet it needed to be a hell that our audience was willing to spend, at least half of each episode in. And
we all sort of do, don't we? Every day in some small way, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it is the familiarity of it where it's both heightened, you feel like you're seeing something you recognize from your life, but also it is heightened enough that you feel like you're escaping in a way. You're escaping into this fantastical world. And I think that somehow that sweet spot is why the show works as well as it does.
Yeah, and I wondered, there's also a great tenderness at the heart. There's Mark's quest, I suppose, his sort of odyssey, but where he falls for, he has memories, real and perceived, and he has a real romance, or is it fake? And so he goes on his own quest, as all your key characters do. You're very sort of firm and fair with how much of the whip everyone gets to crack, I suppose, as well. But there's a lot of tenderness in it. Tenderness is a thing that maybe other people haven't talked about that much. I found it very moving, and I think it's very real about also the love you can have for a workplace, as much as it's a piss take of that thing.
Yeah.
Was that important for you to get in? Was that something that came from other writers? I wonder whether that maybe did not come from the genesis of your old door factory job, Dan.
Well, I think it's incredibly important, and I do think that it was sort of baked into the story. Yeah, not necessarily, from the door factory, although there were very, very nice people at the door factory. And I will say, I wanted to tell a story about a work family, because it's a tricky concept, because like I said earlier, the idea of a work family can be co-opted and used to make you feel like you owe something to the company that you don't really owe. At the same time, it's a real thing to be in the trenches with somebody and have somebody who understands the challenges that you're going through and the absurdities that you're subject to, and who can remind you and nurture your humanity as you nurture theirs. Yeah. And you sort of keep each other human, and often that's through humor, that's through laughter. Sometimes it's just through listening or having somebody to hug you when you really need a hug.
Yeah.
And that, I think it is a deceptively warm show in that way. I think that it was really important to me that there be this very human beating heart at the center of it. And that's something that comes from, my parents, my mom especially. I think always, she would say well, I don't want to watch anything that doesn't have a heart to it. So as weird and as twisty and as dark as this show is, I thought it was important that at the center of it all be something human.
Yeah. And no, I really think that kind of bears itself out, and it's sort of very believable. And then the romances that happen, even if they are simply, and the friendships that blossom or that are already there. Mark has been dropped straight into this thing, as they all end up being dropped into this room on the desk. That Venn diagram of all these relationships is super believable. And I wondered, there's also the psychology, of course, behind it, of changing yourself. And it started for you sort of with the absolute germ of this program was you wondering if you could fast forward your life for 8 hours and just simply be driving out of the parking lot of your door factory job. Right. But there is also a lot of the psychology of changing yourself in the program. And again, I wonder if that was kind of part and parcel, or whether that was written through, or whether one character's journey necessitated that idea of change, or whether that was always there.
Yeah, I think it was, as I developed it, I wanted to be sure that it wasn't just about how we're different people at work versus at home. And I wanted it to be about the reasons why we might disassociate from pieces of ourselves. And one of those is that it's easier. I think it's easier to try to simplify your psychology and be hyper-focused on what you're doing, but also that a company, it's that adage of sort of leave your baggage at the door, leave your personal, whatever you're going through, you leave that at the door. And it's because they only want you to be as human as is valuable to them in your ability to do your job. And so we are encouraged to sort of diminish our humanity a little bit when we walk into that setting. And I think we're willing to, because again, in a way it's easier, and in a way it becomes a drug. Even when I was working at the door factory, there was, even when I didn't want to go into work, there was sometimes a comfort to being there because it was simple. Yeah. And whatever I was going through on the outside, I could sort of put it off for 8 hours each day. So, it's a double-edged sword, I think.
Where would you be without the Door Factory, Dan?
I would nowhere. I'd
have written Severance sooner. No.
Yeah, maybe.
So the cast are obviously absolutely stunning. Adam Scott is so wonderful. Britt Lower, Zach Cherry, John Turturro, Christopher Walken, Patricia Arquette. I mean, it's such a brilliant ensemble cast and quite tight. Mm-hmm. But Tramell Tillman as Mr. Milchick is kind of my favourite character. Mm-hmm. He is inspired as a character and as an actor, as a performance, I should say. Mm-hmm. What was he bolted on? Where did he come from? What's the story of his casting and that character as written and created by you? And we should just say he is the floor manager. He becomes the floor manager of the Severed Souls, doesn't he? Yeah. And he is an authoritarian, but in his own peculiar way. Yeah.
I think that he's somebody who I actually originally envisioned very differently. And my version of him in my head was much more, I don't want to say dumb, but like he was sort of this yes man that would sort of come in and stand behind Cobell and sort of give these these supportive platitudes, right, but was sort of empty-headed. And that was an instance where as soon as Tramell was cast, and I don't remember the exact details of how he was cast, if he did a tape or if he had come in, but as soon as he was in there, I realized that the whole nature of the character had to change because there are so many layers behind Tramell's eyes, and all of a sudden these pleasant platitudes took on something more sinister, where you really got the sense that he was playing, 5-dimensional chess of some kind, and everything that he said had some other meaning behind it and another meaning behind that, and all of a sudden he was one of the most interesting characters on the show. So that was one of those things where, as you're writing, you have to be open to being surprised by stuff like that and letting that change the trajectory of the character and of the show.
Yeah, I mean, he's masterful, the actor, and he's obviously got a lot to do with with what's been written for him. But I mean, he's such a one-off. I mean, no one can replace anyone else, I suppose, slightly ironically for the subject of the show. But,
exactly.
But it's a phenomenal thing. And maybe you can take us briefly to the writers' room. What sort of atmosphere is kept up in that by yourself and Ben Stiller, who's obviously been very associated with the show, and you guys pitched it to Apple and all the rest of it together? What sort of spirit exists in the writers' room? Is it like macro data refinement, or is it like a waffle party, Dan?
Well, I can't say it's like a waffle party, or I'll get in trouble. We don't make people wear masks; they're allowed to have their actual faces out. But it's fun. I mean, I think it's really important that in a setting like that, you allow it to stay fun. Season 2, we had to do via Zoom, which was much harder. I think any writer will tell you.
Jokes famously don't land on Zoom, do they?
They don't land on Zoom, and it's this weird thing, and everybody's, in their house, and there's like a slight delay. And it was very hard to foster that feeling of being together in a space. But, fortunately, we had great people, and they managed to make it work. But yeah, I like being in a space together. I like, taking the first 15 minutes or so to just sort of kick around jokes and talk about our day, and sometimes longer than that. But
you sound like that's sort of like something you have to say just in case the team are listening. They're going to write in and complain.
Yeah, exactly.
He means 2 hours.
Yeah. They're picketing outside right now. But yeah, no, it's that's especially important because the job that we have is pretty darn difficult, and we've got these big elaborate charts up that are tracking multiple character arcs, often for both versions of the character, innie and outie, and we're tracking, different mystery reveals and all these things. And it's hard to do on any show, but I think on this show it's especially complex. And so we have to find ways to keep ourselves sane and keep ourselves human as we go through it.
I was going to ask you about if the sort of quote-unquote murder wall, existed in your writer's room for what happens to everyone at certain times. And you've got this, obviously, the dichotomy of the innie and the outie.
Yeah.
But I think you're talking about, the reveals, and I guess each, shows don't necessarily have to land on a hard cliffhanger when you're on a streaming service. And so that's great, presumably for a writer, I guess. There's discipline in one and luxury and elasticity in the other form of writing.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's a very fat-free show. Like, it's so punchy and to the point and everything needs to be there, which sometimes isn't the case.
Yeah.
When you've got series and series and series and everyone seems to be enjoying themselves. So it's a testament to you and your writer's great kind of wit and wisdom and leanness and meanness, I think, that it's so fat-free.
Thank you.
So people have talked about the fact that this is Orwellian or it's Kafkaesque or it's all sorts of other things. It reminded me of a novel called Piranesi by Sarah Waters, which is an absolutely amazing thing. I'll write it down at the end because you're going to love it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's in no way similar, other than the fact that it is this strange world-building piece of genius. If I read out some words, maybe you can tell me whether they've ever been brought up by yourself or anyone in the writers' room.
Okay.
Is that okay?
All right. Yeah. Let's do it.
So, the meaning of life.
Yes.
Captivity and freedom.
Yes.
The Office. The program.
Oh, yes.
Okay. Control and agency.
Yeah.
And therefore free will. The Day of Judgment and the Book of Revelations, the last book of the Bible.
I'm going to say no. No.
Soviet re-education.
Specifically Soviet? I don't know.
But re-education of some sort.
Re-education, yes. Soviet, I'm not sure.
This is the creepy break room, by the way. Heaven and Hell.
Yeah.
And Trauma and Tenderness.
Yes.
It's been a massive pleasure speaking to
so nice
the one and only creator of the brilliant Severance, Dan Erickson. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Many thanks to Dan Erickson for stopping by Midori House last week. Both seasons of Severance are available to stream globally on Apple TV+, and it really is brilliant. In its 23rd year, the Kinoteka Polish Film Festival celebrates Polish cinema. What else? And runs throughout March and April across the UK. Monocles and their shows, Sophie Monaghan-Coombs sat down with Blanka Konopka to find out more about the festival and some of the key figures who've put the country's film industry on the map.
We have a very, very loyal audience base, so we're really proud to kind of be able to have a lot of loyal viewers every year. But each year we also try and bring something new. So that includes, for example, new Polish cinema. Every year we showcase films that were really kind of popular in the last year or somehow very interesting or iconic. We look at Polish cinema classics, and we also look at key anniversaries. So, for instance, this year we're showcasing a retrospective of Polish director Wojciech Has, because it's actually the 100th anniversary of his birth this year. So that makes it very topical. But yeah, every year we do try and look at something new, something fresh. We've looked at AI, VR-driven short films as well. This year we also have a concert which is inspired by some of the filmography of Krzysztof Kieślowski and Krzysztof Komeda as a jazz musician who was very famous and produced music for a lot of Polish films, and that's kind of being put into a concert with AI-driven visuals. So we've got a lot of interesting things. We try and find something new each year.
For those who are completely sort of unfamiliar with Polish film, as a country it has such a rich filmography and film history, but also is producing some really innovative and kind of well-regarded films now. Maybe you could talk a little bit for those who aren't aware of that rich history and a sort of thriving industry. Maybe you could just try and kind of capture a little bit of it.
Yeah, so the Polish film industry, like you say, does have quite kind of a name for itself. Some of the key directors like Andrzej Wajda, Krzysztof Kieślowski, even Roman Polanski, right? They're very well known. Wojciech Has is a contemporary of theirs, so we're showcasing him this year. However, he's much less well known. However, he also has a very distinctive style, very surrealist, very abstract. So that's something we're looking at this year. But in general, Polish film is definitely defined by the Polish Film School in Łódź, which is actually somewhere that Wojciech Has, whose retrospective we're doing, he taught there. There's definitely a lot of ambition in Polish film and a lot of, I would say, enthusiasm to experiment, maybe, is kind of characteristic of Polish film. A lot of kind of history, a lot of influences from other directors, and also quite a lot of collaborative films. There are quite a lot of Polish and collaborations with other countries as well.
In preparation for this conversation, I watched one of Wojciech Hase's films, and as you say, it's very experimental. It really felt like going down the rabbit hole of something. It was an amazing kind of propulsive watch. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit maybe about some of your favourite films of his, but in general, a little bit more about his style.
Yeah, so I think you're definitely right. So one of the critics of his films from the past described him as, well, if he was to be a painter, he'd be a surrealist painter, right? So it's that kind of, he experiments a lot with time scales, with space, time, kind of with objects, which kind of take on new meanings. So there is this kind of hallucinatory aspect to a lot of his films, but also a very psychological one. He likes to kind of go into troubled characters as well. He has a very distinctive style, which is quite different from, say, Andrzej Wajda or Krzysztof Kieślowski, who are perhaps more well known. But he's definitely somebody to be seen, to be believed, I would say. So the film we're starting with for the retrospective is the Saragossa manuscript, which is perhaps his most iconic one, the one which he's most well known for. And that traverses various different time periods. You've got the Napoleonic Wars, you've got kind of characters in various different parts of history. And then we're ending with the Hourglass Sanatorium, which again, he's very well known for. And that's probably his most, it makes you go a little bit crazy, some critics have said. But both of those have always been very well critically acclaimed. So you've got sort of Martin Scorsese and other directors who have actually said that these films are some of their favourites. So if that's not a reason to go, then I don't know what is.
And I should have said the Hourglass Sanatorium is the one that I watched, which I can highly recommend. You're also showing contemporary films as well. And I wonder if you could talk about those and whether you can, when you're putting together this programme and you're picking up on the historic figures from Polish film history and with the contemporary filmmakers, if you can see those threads between them and also what the contemporary programming is like this year.
Yeah, this year's contemporary programming is quite topical to sort of the geopolitical situation going on. So we had our opening gala this year was Under the Volcano, focusing on a Ukrainian family impacted by the war whilst they're on holiday. We also have tomorrow a very interesting screening at the Barbican, Under the Grey Sky by Mara Tomkovic, and it's her first feature debut, focusing on a journalist who's detained in Belarus. So a lot of the programming this year, I think, has focused on either debuts or early career directors, but also films that have been awarded on the international film circuit, whether that's at the Gdynia Polish Film Festival, which is a very big one in Poland, as well as other festivals around the world. I would say that there's this current affairs element in some of the programming this year.
That was Blanka Konopka, and the Kinoteka Polish Film Festival runs until the 25th of April with a programme that is well worth checking out. And that is all for this week. My thanks to Dan Erickson and again to Blanka Konopka there. Monocle on Culture is produced by Sophie Monaghan-Coombs and Steph Chungu, and Steph also edits the show. We'll be back at the same time next week, but until then, from me, Robert Bounds, thanks for tuning in.